All right, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out on this chilly winter day. Forum on the impacts of the federal budget on Massachusetts residents and institutions. I want to thank Patricia Weinman, she's over there, Christina English from Radius and the Technology and Culture Forum, and outside manning the table is my assistant Cindy Woolley, the three of them key in having events like this. I also might say behind the scenes is the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts that actually supports the Radius program. Now, the new federal tax laws, difficulties Congress has been having in trying to adopt the federal budget, front and center in the news over the past month. These changes will have very significant effects on many of us as well as on our neighbors. However, in my experience, many of these impacts are very poorly recognized, if at all. Thus, my neighbors in Central Square are sharply aware of the MIT graduate students doubling and tripling and quadrupling up into neighborhood apartments. But they generally are totally unaware that these students are paid from federal tax dollars distributed through the NIH, NSF, Department of Energy, other federal agencies. Reductions in those federal programs translate into graduate student and staff layoffs. My biotechnology colleagues are acutely aware of the danger and damage to their long-range programs and staffs from federal cuts in healthcare. But they're generally unaware of the dependence on the federal budget of the Red Line, the Green Line, the regional bus service, computer rail, Northeast corridor, which the local high-tech economy absolutely depends on, right? People take it for granted, but you can't run trains on property taxes. In fact, the amount of information available to even a concerned citizen is painfully small. No article in the Boston Globe over the past month, or the New York Times, reporting the hang-up in Congress, closing down of the government over the budget. Actually,
I have an op-ed in the Times.
aha, okay, all right. All right, we got a few champions here, right? But in general, the professional reporting staff, there's been no numbers. What are the size of the programs that are being debated? What's going to be cut? What's not going to be cut? Nothing in there hard information. Some observers claim the public is not interested in numbers and details. But you just turn to the sports pages and you will find analysis of every Patriots play in the AFC playoffs. How many passes were caught by receivers, the number and average gains for the runners, tabulation of the votes for the baseball entry into the Hall of Fame, scorecards giving minutes played, assists, rebounds, offensive rebounds, defensive rebounds, field goals for each player in every Celtics game. It's clear there are tens of thousands of people who are very interested in data. Right? The Globe is not a charity. During tax time, Americans and all the media outlets gripe about paying income tax. But no agency of the federal government has ever written back to you and told you how the Congress spent your tax dollars last year. Right? In fact, people don't know what you're talking about. When I give a talk, I say, well, what do you mean? Right? Since they've never, ever had a direct communication from the government about how the tax dollars are spent, it becomes invisible. Now, I served for years, and I still do, on Washington committees of the National Biomedical Research Societies, where we're lobbying around the NIH and NSF budgets. I personally believe that the withholding of this information is actually part of a conscious effort to keep the majority of the American public from knowing where their tax dollars are being spent. Whether or not that's the case, it remains difficult to find this information. One of the reasons we organized this panel is we were finding it so difficult to get some information on the cuts. You call up Capuano's office, he's on the Transportation Committee, and you ask him about the cuts in the transportation budget, he doesn't know. Not sure. Complicated, right? It's all woven together. So, however, a number of our panelists represent the opposite. People who understand the need for clarity, for data, for relevant numbers, and they've agreed to speak to us, thankfully. So our opening speaker is Lindsay Koshgarian of the National Priority Project, little office there in Northampton, Massachusetts, and all over the United States. Social advocacy groups look to their numbers for an accurate reporting of what's going on in the federal government. I'll just introduce quickly because we started late. She'll be followed by Josh Hoxie, who works for the Institute for Policy Studies, very important Washington think tank, but lo and behold, they have an office in Boston. And then we have our own Maria Zuba, Vice President of Research, fighting for those of us who make our living in research.
Thanks for having me. So I want to also say about National Priorities Project. Yes, we're based in Northampton, just a couple hours west of here. And now we are also a project of the very important Institute for Policy Studies. So we're both kind of housed at the same place. Institute for Policy Studies is a progressive DC think tank, and the National Priorities Project in particular is dedicated to making the federal budget transparent so that citizens can take action and advocate for a federal budget that prioritizes peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. So we are kind of in the middle of an endlessly ongoing federal budget process right now. I liked Jonathan's mention of people's interest in sports statistics very much. I'm sure there are people here who are fans of 538 in the room and kind of get that dynamic of how a shared interest in sports statistics can also spill over into an interest in policy and politics and all things related. Although I'm not sure that we want to actually advocate for sports fan style involvement in the political process. I think maybe we already have enough of that going on. So we're in the middle of this federal budget process, and we're in the middle of a federal budget year that began on October 1st, and for which there is still no budget. And I couldn't agree more that this does not get enough attention. Of course, it was on everybody's minds for just a couple days over the weekend for anybody who was actually following the news that weekend instead of, playoffs or any other number of things. And because there was a shutdown. But that shutdown lasted less than 3 days, and now it's back off the agenda. Now, there are some backroom negotiations going on. Part of the reason that we aren't seeing numbers coming out for what's being debated is because these are backroom negotiations that are happening right now, to the extent that anything's happening at all. This is not the way the process is supposed to happen. The process is supposed to involve 12 budget bills being introduced in committee in Congress and debated and voted on and then put together into one budget package over a period of about 6 months, and it hasn't worked that way for decades. The process is completely broken, and now what we have, and in recent years it seems to, if anything, be getting even worse, to the point where last year we didn't have a final federal budget for the fiscal year that began in October until May. And this year we're headed at least into mid-February before we get a budget deal for the current fiscal year. So this is a process that is very, very broken, and I think is sort of a really good illustration of a lot of things that are broken in Congress as well. But I know that I'm here to talk about how the federal budget impacts here in Massachusetts, and also to the extent that I can to talk about how the federal budget might impact MIT. So in Massachusetts, about 28% of state general revenues come directly from the federal government. That's about $14 billion. It is roughly equivalent to the amount of revenue that Massachusetts brings in through its income tax. It is far greater than the amount that Massachusetts brings in through its sales tax. So federal revenues are a really important of money for the state of Massachusetts, and that's just the state budget. Budget chunk includes things like Medicaid. It's a very large part of that is funds for Medicaid. It includes welfare. It includes heating and housing programs for low-income people, transportation, education, primarily K-12 education, but also higher education, block grants, WIC, which is the nutrition program for women, infants, and children, Superfund sites, sorts of other things that affect our Commonwealth. So it touches pretty much every aspect of life. But in addition to that $14 billion that goes directly to the state government, there's also about $41 billion that goes directly to individuals in the form of individual aid. So that's Social Security, Medicare, SNAP, which is food stamps, unemployment, and other programs. There are also 46,000 federal employees in Massachusetts, people who depend for their income on the federal government. And they have high incomes. These are good jobs. The federal government employee average income in Massachusetts is about $76,000 compared to $67,000 average salary for all the employees in the state. So these are high-paying jobs. And federal jobs are also important sources of opportunity for people of color and other people who are often unfairly shut out of the labor market just for sheer reasons of sort of entrenched racism. But the federal government does a much better job of employing people of color than the private sector does. So losing those jobs in any number is a big deal.
Is it also true for the state jobs?
I'm not sure as much about state jobs, actually. That's a great question. I would expect, because they have similar protections in place, that it might be a similar story, but I don't have numbers off the top of my head. The city of Boston received $98 million for its public schools in the last school year for which there's data. And 350,000 Massachusetts residents relied on federal programs for housing, like Section 8 public housing and other programs. There are also $13 billion in federal contracts that come into the state. And this is where I shift from, isn't the federal government a great thing for Massachusetts, to, wow, it looks like a great thing at first, but let's think about what we're actually doing here, because the vast majority, over $10 billion of that $13 billion in federal contracts, is coming from the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense is right now at about 53 to 54% of the federal discretionary budget. The military budget is higher than it's been at any point since under Ronald Reagan and during the Cold War. And this is after we've decreased military spending actually since the height of Iraq War in about 2008 and 2009. So even after cutting spending, we're still higher than we were at any point during the 1980s. So this is a huge amount of money. This is money that is not going to other programs like education or healthcare or dealing with climate change or creating jobs in a more direct fashion. And part of the reason that this happens is because the Defense Department is a big creator of jobs. There are all sorts of studies that are directed at Massachusetts politicians talking about the job creation effects of the defense industry in Massachusetts. Raytheon is one of the largest federal contractors in the world, and they are right here, very close by. They got $3.5 billion in federal contracts in Massachusetts in 2017. General Electric is another big Defense Department contractor right here in Massachusetts. And number 3 is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which brought in $1 billion in Defense Department contracts in 2017. Pretty astounding, $1 billion. It's hard to even imagine that there's $1 billion around here. But then again, we are in Cambridge and we're surrounded by both defense and pharmaceuticals, and there are billions and billions of dollars kind of hiding in the pockets all over the place here. And in Massachusetts, the defense industry has kind of a specialty in guided missiles. So that's what they're working on. That's what this money is going toward. And when we have ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan that are spilling over into Syria and Yemen, we're selling weapons to countries that are involved in these conflicts directly. And this is, it's a real question, I think, of whether this is a good thing for our Commonwealth to be contributing to, or whether perhaps we might want to take that money and put it to another use. Just talking a little more about Raytheon itself, which is right here as well. Raytheon earned over half of its sales from Department of Defense contracts in the last year that I have data for, and paid its CEO more than $12 million. That's half of its sales coming from the federal government, and so that's a federally subsidized $12 million salary. There was also an incident back in September. Some of you may or may not have seen in the news. Raytheon workers picketed in Andover over their pay. Their raises were lower than the rate of inflation. Their health benefits, saying that they often had to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket, even though they had health insurance. And so they picketed. Their union employees, they picketed. They've also been saying that Raytheon is moving employment away from its union bases here and factories and sites here in Massachusetts to other states where unions are weaker and they can open non-unionized facilities. So I'm wrapping up. So in the context of this budget fight, the number one thing that it's being fought over is DACA, is relief for the Dreamers. The number two thing that's being fought over is how much of the money is going to go to the military versus how much of the money is going to go to everything else. That is what is being debated right now in those back rooms. And over the next 10 days until they have the next deadline, that's one of the things that needs to be worked out. And so for those of you who have your members of Congress on speed dial, that's one of the things that you can call them and say, look, I want as much money for non-military priorities as you're putting toward military priorities.
Thank you. Very good.